Imagine for a moment an entire society where grief wasn't just a private feeling, but a public performance, a spectacle with strict rules, costumes, and timelines. Well, for almost 100 years, the Victorians lived that reality. So let's pull back the black veil and figure out how and why an entire era dressed for death.
And that really is the big question, right? Because we're not just talking about a few people choosing to wear black. This was a massive, society-wide system that told millions of people exactly how to express their loss. So what on earth was going on? Okay, to really get this, we have to understand the world they were living in. And the Victorian world, well, it was a place where death was, to put it bluntly, a constant companion. It was everywhere.
I mean, just look at this number. The average person didn't even live to see 50. Think about that for a second. Death wasn't some far-off concept for the elderly. It was an immediate, everyday presence for everyone.
And this is just gut-wrenching. Roughly half of all children never made it to be adults. Women passed away in childbirth, men in factory accidents. Loss wasn't the exception, it was the absolute norm. So, when you're living in that reality, a kind of cultural anxiety starts to build. And the biggest fear wasn't actually dying. No, the real terror was being forgotten. It was dying and not getting a decent burial, not being remembered the right way. That fear is the key to everything else. Now, all this anxiety needed a focus, a role model, and boy did it get one. The most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria. Her own personal tragedy was about to set the stage for an entire nation's grief. When her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she was completely devastated. But her mourning didn't last for just a year or two. The Queen wore black for the rest of her life, for 40 years. She became the living, breathing symbol of the devoted, grieving widow for her entire empire to see. And her decades-long grief wasn't just a personal choice. It basically became unofficial law. The royal court started issuing these super strict etiquette guides, and her private sorrow trickled down to every single level of society, becoming the gold standard for how you were supposed to grieve. So what did this national performance of sorrow actually look like? Well, it was like a massive, complicated stage play with a very specific script that told you who had to mourn, what they had to wear, and exactly how long they had to do it for. But here's the thing. The burden of this performance fell almost entirely on women. A man, well, he could put on a black armband, maybe a hatband, and just get on with his life. For a woman, though, especially a widow, it was a total life takeover. She had to withdraw from society and completely change her appearance.
And the timelines were incredibly detailed. A widow, for instance, was expected to be in some stage of mourning for up to 2.5 years. The closer you were to the person who died, the longer and stricter your mourning period was. Each stage came with a specific uniform. A widow would start in full mourning, which meant she was covered from head to toe in this dull, non-reflective black fabric called crepe. Over years, she'd slowly get to transition. First, she could wear less crepe, then maybe add some simple jet jewelry. And finally, in the half-mourning phase, she could reintroduce muted colors like gray or violet. It was a slow, visible walk back into the world of the living. So, you have millions of people who all need very specific, rule-bound outfits at a moment's notice. What does that create? You guessed it, a booming industry. Grief became very, very good for business. You started seeing these huge mourning warehouses pop up. They were basically the first department stores, but just for death. And as this ad shows, they made it clear they were for everyone, rich or poor. It was one-stop shopping to make sure you didn't commit a social faux pas. Even the job of the undertaker changed completely. They went from just handling the body to becoming funeral directors. Basically, they were event planners for the deceased. They'd arrange the fancy horse-drawn hearses, hire professional mourners, yes, that was a real job, and even prep the house by covering mirrors and windows. But all this public spectacle wasn't the whole story. There was a much more personal side to all of this, a deep, human desire to keep a physical piece of a loved one with you, to keep their memory alive. Now, for centuries, people had kept memento mori, objects, often skulls, that were meant to remind you that, hey, you're going to die too. But the Victorians took this old idea and gave it a whole new meaning. Yeah, they totally flipped the script. For the Victorians, these objects weren't about remembering death. They were about defying it. They were tokens of memory, meant to preserve a little piece of a person forever. And what's one part of us that doesn't decay? Hair. It lasts for a very, very long time. So for them, weaving a lock of a loved one's hair into a piece of jewelry wasn't just a craft. It was like holding a tiny, immortal piece of the person you had lost. The historian Deborah Lutz calls these things secular relics. It's a perfect description. They weren't morbid. They were objects that held this powerful wish that somehow the person they belonged to could continue to exist. That same idea drove the practice of post-mortem photography. And while it might seem strange to us, you have to remember that for most families, this was the only picture they would ever own of a child or a parent. They weren't trying to capture death, they were desperately trying to preserve one last peaceful image of life. So if this was such a huge part of their culture, why don't we do this anymore? Well, this whole golden age of mourning came to a surprisingly sudden end, all because of one single monumental event. World War I. The scale of death was just unimaginable. After millions of people died, the idea of one person engaging in a 2-year, elaborate, individual display of grief suddenly seemed, well, self-indulgent. The sheer scale of the collective sorrow just completely overwhelmed the old rituals. Which really leaves us with a fascinating question to think about. The Victorians had this very public, physical, tangible language for grief. Today, our mourning is often so private, so digital. It makes you wonder. And moving on from their elaborate rituals, what have we gained, and what might we have lost?